The cellar of the Mightwood home was a chamber of shadows, a hollow beneath the earth where secrets took root in the damp soil. Cobwebs festooned the ceiling like tattered banners, and the air was thick with the must of aging wood and the tang of iron from racks laden with tools and bottles of wine. Frederick's footsteps echoed as he descended the stone steps, a lone taper flickering in his hand, casting ghostly silhouettes against the walls. Frederick. Elsa's voice wove through the dimness as she materialized from the darkness, her sisters Varya and Indri flanking her like somber sentinels. Our father is resolute in his madness. Madness? Frederick queried, his brow furrowing as the flame quivered, reflecting in his eyes. Indeed, she affirmed, her tone grave as she stepped into the circle of light. He desires Mozdeville to fall before the Danish horde. He believes that only then will King Reinford heed his pleas for military expansion to the north. Then we are but pawns in a game of power, Frederick muttered, feeling a knot of anger tighten within him. His gaze shifted between the sisters, seeking some spark of defiance. Which is why we must outmaneuver him, Varya interjected, her voice steady and determined. She moved forward, her silhouette sharpening in the candlelight. We propose a journey to Norbenton. Ha! The laugh escaped Frederick's lips before he could stifle it, a bitter sound in the close confines. Norbenton harbours no love for Mozdeville. They would sooner watch us burn. Yet, Indri added, her eyes gleaming with a cunning that belied her soft features. Should they see Mozdeville's envoy hand in hand with the daughters of Dagel, their enmity may well give way to alliance. Fake though it may be, Elsa stated, a cold edge to her words. But once our father sees Norbenton standing with us, surely even he must act. The illusion of unity might just compel him to lend aid. Frederick pondered, the wax dripping onto his fingers unnoticed. Indri's plan danced on the fringes of audacity, a bold stroke that could unite or unravel them all. Yet within that gamble glinted a spark of possibility. Your strategy bears the sheen of cleverness, he conceded, his mind racing with the implications. A masquerade of alliance to draw forth genuine support. Exactly, Elsa replied, her lips curving in a semblance of a smile that did not reach her eyes. We play the Game of Thrones, Frederick, and we must play it well. Very well, Frederick said, the taper's light flickering as if in agreement. To Norbenton we shall go, and may fortune favour our deceit. The three sisters nodded, united in purpose, their faces set in grim determination. The cellar, once just a forgotten cavity beneath a grand house, now bore witness to the birth of an uneasy pact, one that might just turn the tide against the encroaching darkness. Under the watchful gaze of a full moon, a village just off the coast of the British Isle stood as a fortress against the encroaching darkness. Its high wooden walls, sharpened at the top like spearheads thrusting toward the heavens, promised safety and defiance. The air was brisk with the salt of the North Sea, and the timber battlements bore the scars of past conflicts, each notch a silent testament to survival. "Fish are scarce," grumbled a burly man, his axe biting into the pine log with a thud. "We've been casting our nets wider, but the sea's as empty as a pauper's purse." "Then we turn to the woods," another replied, hoisting a freshly split log over his shoulder. "The forest teems with game, and the ground offers up tubers if you know where to look." His voice carried the certainty of a man accustomed to adaptation, a trait the villagers had honed through necessity. "Traps for rabbits and snares for boar," said a woman with arms like the oars of a longship, her short sword strapped tightly to her waist. We may not feast on herring, but we won't starve." As they spoke, their breaths mingled with the chill night air, forming spectral plumes that dissipated into the ether. A sense of camaraderie united them, born from shared hardships and the determination to persevere. But tranquility is a fragile thing, and it shattered with the ferocity of a storm-born wave when shadows surged over the ramparts, dark forms that descended upon the village with the silence of death itself. The invaders' presence was announced by the ring of steel and the screams of the unprepared. "Vikings!" someone shouted, the alarm spreading like wildfire. Panic laced the cry, but it also summoned resolve. These people were no strangers to bloodshed. Sigurd, his blonde hair a pale banner in the moonlight, led the charge, his blue eyes reflecting the chaos. With each swing of his sword, a defender fell, his movements both graceful and grim, a dance macabre etched in violence. Beside him, Fjarl, a brute of a man with a lust for battle, revelled in the carnage, his laughter a discordant symphony amidst the clash of arms. "Stand fast!" yelled the first villager, rallying his companions as he parried a blow from an attacker. "Die, Northman scum!" spat the woman warrior, thrusting her spear with lethal precision, only to have it shatter against the shield of an enemy. Yet for all their bravery, the villagers were outmatched. The Vikings moved through the town like a tidal wave, unstoppable and uncaring, leaving death and despair in their wake. Men and women, armed with little more than their will to live, were cut down where they stood, their blood soaking into the earth that had fed them. Sigurd's heart hammered within his chest as he fought. Each life he extinguished was a weight upon his soul, a burden he bore in the name of his people. These villagers were not his enemies, merely obstacles on the path to conquest. Yet there was no joy in their demise. Only duty, harsh and unyielding as the steel in his hands. And as the last defender crumpled to the ground, his body cleaved nearly in two by Viking swords, the village square fell eerily silent, a silence that rang louder than any battle cry. Several miles to the west, under the gossamer glow of a full moon, Emie and Eadric scoured the shadowed groves near Lamishtu Hill, their hands deftly sifting through the nocturnal foliage for the ingredients Emie had insisted were necessary. The trees whispered secrets on the wind, an eerie chorus to their clandestine activity. "Here," Emie murmured, plucking a gnarled root from the earth. "The mandrake." "Are we not done yet?" Eadric asked, his eyes darting nervously toward the dark outline of the forest. "This place, it feels wrong." "Patience," she chided with an inscrutable smile, her fingers working nimbly. "We need everything I listed." Suddenly, a looming figure emerged from the thicket, as silent as the grave. A Viking spy, broad-shouldered and bearded, his eyes glinting like shards of ice under the lunar light. With a feral grace, he lunged at Eadric, who clumsily reached for the hilt of his sword, but was too slow, too hesitant. "Emie!" Eadric choked out, gasping as the Norseman's iron grip tightened around his throat. "Look at me, Northman," Emie commanded, her voice low and laced with power. She touched the red stone at her neck, locking eyes with the intruder. The Viking's formidable posture faltered, his eyes widened in horror as paralysis seized him. Blood seeped from the corners of his eyes, trailing down past the bridge of his nose, painting crimson lines across his hardened features. "Don't fight it. You've already lost, Northman," Emie intoned, her gaze unwavering. A grotesque foam bubbled forth from the man's lips, his breaths ragged and strained. Then, with a dreadful calmness, he drew his own dagger and slashed it across his throat. A scarlet cascade poured forth, staining the fallen leaves below. "By all that is sacred!" Eadric exhaled, his voice trembling with shock and revulsion. With the spy now slumped lifelessly on the ground, Emie kneeled beside the corpse. Her hands, unshaken by the gruesome task ahead, began to undress the man with clinical detachment. She produced a skinning knife, its blade catching the moonlight, and with surgical precision she sliced into the flesh. "Emie, what are you?" Eadric's words lodged in his throat, his stomach roiling as she parted the flesh, revealing the slick, steaming innards beneath. "Every part has its purpose," she said, unaffected by the stench of death. Her fingers delved within the cavity, emerging with the kidneys, wet and glistening in her bloodied palms. Eadric's mind reeled, torn between fascination and horror. How could she remain so composed amid such macabre workings? How could she not flinch at the sight of a man's splayed body, at the visceral reality of death? "Emie, how can you bear this?" he whispered. "Death is a passage, not an end," she responded cryptically, her eyes never leaving the organs in her grasp. "And some passages must be opened with a key of flesh and bone." Meanwhile, a calm night had fallen on Degel like a shroud, and with it came the harbingers of doom. Viking raiders, shadows under the pale moonlight, descended upon the village, their battle cries slicing through the stillness like jagged knives. Homes ablaze cast an eerie glow, silhouetting frenzied figures as they clashed in desperate combat, a maelstrom of steel and flame. "Frederick, this way!" Indri's voice pierced the cacophony, her hand gripping his as she pulled him towards the dubious safety of an alleyway. "Keep close," Frederick rasped, his breaths ragged with exertion and fear. He could barely keep pace with Indri's urgent strides, his mind reeling at the savagery that unfolded around them. The night air was thick with the scent of blood and smoke, the wails of the wounded a haunting refrain to their flight. Their escape was short-lived. 2 hulking Vikings loomed before them, their swords glinting ominously in the firelight. One, a bear of a man with a tangled beard, sneered menacingly, while the other, lean and wolfish with predatory eyes, licked his lips with cruel anticipation. "Look what we have here," the bearded one growled, raising his sword. "A little bird and her lapdog. Touch her and I'll—" Frederick's threat died on his lips as cold steel kissed his throat. "Brave words for a dead man!" the wolfish Viking hissed, his gaze sliding over Indri with vile intent. "And after we're done with you, the lass will—" His words were abruptly cut off, not by a scream, but by the sickening sound of flesh rending from flesh. From the brush erupted a monstrous form, a nightmare made flesh. Its fur was a matted tapestry of black and silver, eyes glowing with infernal light, fangs bared in a snarl that promised death. The werewolf lunged, powerful jaws clamping down on the bearded Viking's throat. Blood spurted in a grotesque fountain as the brute crumpled silently to the ground. The remaining Viking barely had time to raise his weapon before the beast was upon him, claws tearing through chainmail as if it were parchment. It ended swiftly. The Viking fell, his body mutilated beyond recognition. Frederick stood, paralyzed, his heart thunderous in his chest. The werewolf turned its hellish gaze upon him, and for a fleeting moment he saw something akin to acknowledgement before the creature bounded away, vanishing into the tumultuous night toward Degel. "Frederick, we must go!" Indri tugged at his sleeve, her voice laced with both awe and terror. "Right," he murmured, his thoughts a whirlwind of disbelief and relief. Together they resumed their headlong flight toward Norbenton. Sigurd, his long hair wild in the fray, moved through the melee with grim determination. His blade sang a dirge for each life it claimed, a lamentation for warriors fated to meet their end upon its edge. Yet, amidst the slaughter, Sigurd's blue eyes sought out the defenceless, steering his wrath away from women and children who cowered amidst the chaos. "Leave them be," he roared when he saw some of his men nearing the unarmed. "They are not our quarrel!" But not all heeded his command. Fjarl, marked by his missing ear, revelled in the carnage, his axe cleaving a crimson path without distinction. A woman's scream heralded his blade's descent, and a small child, too slow to flee, met a gruesome end beneath the arc of his terrible axe. "Enough!" Sigurd bellowed, horror and rage propelling him forward. He collided with Fjarl, tackling him with the force of a tempest. They hit the ground hard, Sigurd's fists finding their mark on Fjarl's face. Each blow was a rebuke, a denial of the senseless cruelty wrought by his comrade's hand. "Sigurd! Off him!" other voices called, but he was deaf to all save the beating of his own heart. "Never! Against children!" Sigurd panted between strikes, his knuckles smeared with blood, some his, most Fjarl's. Fjarl laughed amidst the assault, sputum and blood staining his grin. "Weak! Just like—" Before another word could poison the air, the battle-hardened hands of their fellow warriors pulled them apart. But not before Sigurd's knuckles had painted Fjarl's visage with the hues of defeat and disgrace. "Control your fury, Sigurd," one warrior admonished, though his grip on Sigurd's arm betrayed a shared disquiet. "Victory is ours," another said, gesturing to the subdued town. "Don't mar it with infighting." "Children," Sigurd spat, the word a curse upon his lips. "There is no victory in the murder of innocents." "Enough!" The familiar voice of Valdemar commanded attention, and silence fell upon the warriors. "Set ablaze what remains. Our message shall be clear to all." Valdemar was unable to read, but for a leader of ruthless pirates, such skills were unnecessary. The wooden sign erected at the centre of town, bearing the words, "God bless Norbenton. We shall overcome all obstacles," had little effect on the illiterate and even less effect on the soulless. He kicked the sign down before returning to his encampment outside of town. "Vithorn would never forgive this," Sigurd growled, his voice a low rumble of restrained fury. He stood over the crumpled form of Fjarl, whose nose was already swelling into a grotesque mockery of its former self. "Forgiveness?" Fjarl cackled, blood spattering from his split lips as he looked up at Sigurd with scorn. "You think too highly of your precious Vethorn and too little of victory." "Enough!" Valdemar's voice cut through the tension like a blade through sinew. His broad frame wedged itself between the two warriors, his gaze as sharp as the sword he wielded in battle. "We stand united, or we fall divided. Do not forget who leads you." Sigurd stepped back, but not without casting a final contemptuous glance at Fjarl. The surrounding men watched, the air thick with judgment, and the stench of charred wood and flesh. Valdemar turned to address his horde, every word punctuated by the crackling flames that consumed Norbenton. "Let the blaze be our herald! Burn what remains!" Valdemar commanded. His men moved with grim purpose, setting torch to timber. Meanwhile, beneath the luminescent glow of the full moon, Emie and Eadric stood in the shadow of Lameshtu Hill. The air held the chill of impending doom, and the night whispered secrets only she could decipher. "I had the ingredients all along," Emie confessed, her dark eyes reflecting the moonlight. "But I sensed a spy hidden among us, watching, waiting." Eadric's face was a canvas of confusion and concern. "Why bring me out here, then?" "Because I know you, Eadric Perrymane," Emie said, her gaze softening ever so slightly. "You would walk through fire for those you love. You wouldn't have left Aiden's side for mere herbs." He shifted uncomfortably, his fingers brushing against the hilt of his sword, a sword he hadn't been quick enough to draw earlier. "So it was a ruse, to draw out a spy?" "More than that," Emie replied, her voice taking on an edge sharper than any blade. "It was to prove our defences are not as hollow as they may seem, and because I know your loyalty is unshakable. Besides, your father is stronger than you credit him. It's likely just influence sickness he suffers from. He'll be on his feet soon enough." The moon hung full and unblinking in the ink-black sky. The lunar glow cast long shadows over the ground. A distant howl cleaved the silence. Eadric looked over to Emie as if to verify that ears had not deceived him. A smirk played upon her lips. "It's merely one of night's creatures. And with this," she touched the zinstone pendant resting against her chest, "no werewolf would dare approach. They respect the power it holds." "Respect?" Eadric's voice held a tinge of incredulity, mingled with the newfound knowledge of horrors he had never imagined to be true. "Werewolves are real, then?" he asked, while moving to collect kindling. "Real and bound by rules you're only beginning to understand. Pay the beasts no mind tonight. Your family is safely behind the walls of Mozdeville, and I have the Sinnerstone," she replied. "Right now I must harvest these remains. Each organ performs a different function within the body, Eadric, and so each part of the body attracts a different kind of spiritual entity." As Eadric struck flint to steel, sparks leaping to ignite the tinder, his thoughts turned inward. How could she speak so casually of such dark matters? Of using body parts to commune with entities unseen? The fire caught, crackling to life, and he focused on the flames, trying to find solace in their dance. "Emie," Eadric began, feeding the young flame with more wood. "What sort of spirits are we talking about?" "Many kinds," she said, eyes reflecting the firelight as she washed her hands in a shallow basin. "Some benign, others less so. But all can be persuaded to lend their abilities to those who know how to properly request their power." Persuaded? The word tasted bitter in Eadric's mouth. "At what cost?" "Depends on what you seek," Emie replied, rolling up her sleeves. "And how well you prepare your offering." "One only receives what one offers, is that it?" "Perhaps," Emie conceded with a shrug. "But each side always believes he or she is getting the better end of the deal." "Is there no end to the depths we'll sink to fend off these invaders?" he asked. "Depth is a matter of perspective," Emie responded, her voice low and infused with an enigmatic certainty. "What some see as a descent, others view as the necessary path to survival." Eadric watched the flames leap and twist, casting their light upon Emie's features. A mesmerizing interplay of shadow and illumination that seemed to mirror the duality within her, within them all. In the flickering firelight, he saw not just the woman who had deceived him, but also the ally who had saved his life. "Let us hope that the path we've chosen doesn't lead us too far into the dark," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "Darkness is merely the absence of light, Eadric Perrymane," Emie answered, her gaze locked onto the inferno, "and we are the bearers of flame." Under the baleful gaze of the full moon, the forest around them seemed to breathe, a symphony of rustling leaves and snapping twigs. Eadric's fingers grazed the hilt of his sword. a futile reassurance against the supernatural forces Emie had laid bare. "Tell me of Aishet Zanunim," he demanded, a shiver running down his spine despite the warmth of the fire. "You spoke her name with a familiarity that chills my blood." Emie's eyes reflected the dance of the flames as she began her tale. Aishet Zanunim was once a celestial being, brilliant and powerful, but her desires were earthly. She yearned not for the heavens, but for the Garden of Eden, for Adam himself, she explained, her voice dipping into a cadence that seemed almost ritualistic. God cursed her for such lust, banished her from the divine presence. In her exile, she became something other, a creature of shadow and malice, spurned and vengeful, Emie continued, her hands gesturing like an artist painting a scene of dark beauty. Her hatred for the descendants of Adam and Eve is matched only by that of Lilith, another who shares her fate. Yet while Lilith's fury is wild and untamed, Aishet's is cold and calculated. She seeks to undermine, to corrupt, and to claim souls for her own dark purpose. Eadric felt his heart tighten in his chest. The story was more than myth. It was a warning. He could barely reconcile the woman before him, speaking of demons and curses, with the Emie Zinnethush who charmed everyone in Mozdeville with ease. Such spirits, they hold powers beyond our understanding, Emie said, drawing him back from his thoughts. Powers that can be borrowed by those willing to pay the price. You speak of dealings with darkness as if it were mere trade at the market, Eadric accused, his voice laced with both fear and disbelief. One cannot serve God and traffic with such entities. Ah, but I do not deal in absolutes, Eadric Perrymane, Emie countered, leaning forward, her face half lit by the flickering glow. What is dark magic but another force in this world? Just as the wind can fill a sail or topple a tree, magic is a tool. It is the intent behind its use that defines its nature. Yet you wield this tool without hesitation, Eadric observed, his mind racing with implications. Should I hesitate when our very existence is threatened? Emie asked, her gaze piercing into his soul. I serve who I must when I must. On Sunday I may call upon God to fortify my spirit. On Monday I may whisper to the shadows to protect those I care for. And so can you, Eadric. So can you. His body tensed, torn between the righteousness instilled in him since childhood and the desperate need to defend his home. Emie's words echoed within him, mingling with the primal instincts that urged him to survive, no matter the cost. Where does it end, though? He pondered aloud, his gaze locked onto the chaotic dance of the flames. At what point do we become the very monsters we're trying to fend off? Perhaps when there are no more choices left, Emie replied softly, her expression unreadable. Or perhaps when we stop questioning the path we're on. The conversation hung heavy in the air, as thick as the scent of pine and smoke. Eadric felt the weight of their situation settle upon his shoulders like a mantle woven from twilight itself. In the darkness beyond the firelight, the world held its breath, waiting for the next move in a game played by gods and mortals alike. Kidneys, Emie remarked offhandedly, her hands crimson as she held one up to the light, inspecting it with clinical detachment. They filter the blood, purify it from toxins, a natural alchemist within our very flesh. Where did you learn of such things? Eadric asked, struggling to keep his composure as he watched her work. Despite the revulsion churning within him, he couldn't deny the morbid fascination that gripped him. From texts hidden away by those who fear the power of knowledge, she responded, her tone laced with disdain. The Church would rather we remain shackled in ignorance than risk the enlightenment that comes with understanding the world around us. Eadric wrestled with the implications of her words, the teachings of his faith clashing violently with the stark reality before him. His father's stern voice echoed in his mind, extolling the virtues of obedience and the dangers of heresy. Can freedom truly be found in such dark pursuits? He queried, the doubt in his voice plain. Freedom, Emie mused, pausing in her work to lock eyes with him. Is knowing less ever truly freedom? The Church may offer comfort, but it also demands blind loyalty. I seek my own path. Even if that path leads to darkness? Eadric challenged, unable to mask the apprehension that coloured his question. Darkness and light are but two sides of the same coin, she said, returning to her task with renewed focus. One cannot exist without the other. It is not about serving one or the other, Eadric. It's about balance, about survival. Survival, he echoed, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. Yet, as he looked upon Emie, her hands deft and sure, even in such gruesome work, he couldn't help but wonder if perhaps there was truth in her words. The world outside was a tapestry of grey, where good men died and evil often triumphed. Maybe it was time to look beyond the black and white absolutes he had always known. Survival, he repeated, more firmly this time, steeling himself for the trials ahead. Emie worked with an unsettling diligence. Her hands smeared crimson as she spoke. The Church does, for all its faults, maintain order, she said, slicing off the top of a fresh kidney with a precision that chilled Eadric to his core. With a flick of her wrist, the bloody chunk landed in a wooden bowl with a soft, wet sound. On this we can both agree, but you are a butcher that believes herself better than the Church. I only indulge your presence right now because it is your abilities that saved me earlier. Eadric gasped, swallowing hard against the bile rising in his throat. Still, this is pure butchery. Order can be a guise for control, Emie retorted, her voice calm as she cut out both of the Viking spy's eyes and mashed them into the bowl. Her fingers moved deftly, without hesitation or disgust. And sometimes, chaos unveils truths hidden by that very order. Truths? Eadric's voice trembled, the stench of death invading his senses. He watched, horrified, as the contents of the bowl mixed into a grotesque paste. A lizard tail, a frog's tongue, and a ghost mushroom followed, each ingredient more vile than the last. Powerful truths, Emie affirmed, her eyes reflecting the flicker of candlelight as she compressed the spy's extracted heart, squeezing until blood seeped and filled the bowl halfway. Truths about our world, about the forces that shape it, and about ourselves. Eadric stared at the congealing mess, feeling a surge of nausea as he grappled with the darkness unfolding before him. Emie's words spun around in his mind, a maelstrom of doubt and fear. "Does this not trouble your conscience?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. "We are not so different from beasts if we revel in such gore." "Trouble me?" Emie paused, her gaze piercing through the shadows. "I have long since learned to look beyond the repulsion. I see what must be done for protection, for power." Protection? Power? Eadric's heart pounded against his ribs. Is it worth the price of our humanity? Humanity? Emie scoffed softly, her hands never ceasing their work. Tell me, Eadric, when the Vikings come, will they spare you for your humanity? Or will they slaughter us just the same? Eadric had no answer. The truth in her words stung like a slap. He could feel his convictions wavering, his faith in absolutes crumbling under the weight of necessity. Think, Eadric. Emie's voice was a siren's call amidst the horror. What is the true measure of sin? Blindness to reality? Or doing what is necessary to survive? Survive, Eadric repeated, the term hollow on his lips. He wanted to reject her words, to cling to the purity of his beliefs, but the image of the mutilated spy, a threat now vanquished, spoke of a grim pragmatism he could not deny. Emie lifted the bowl of blood and essence fuel. She smiled at Eadric and held the contents above her head. Etum les forlem acavun Emie nashtari. She drank from the bowland Eadric watched as blood trickled from the sides of her mouth. The salty human and critter paste descended her esophagus and into her core as she closed her eyes and placed her hands together. A gust of wind blew out the firelight as Eadric rose to his feet. The Zinnestone began to glow a bright red, as did the piercing eyes of Emie. The conjurer began to levitate from the forest floor and gazed down as Eadric. "Observe, Perrymane!" Emie pointed her finger at a grand oak tree to her right as a stream of shadow, dark as the sun is bright, escaped her palm and engulfed the tree. Leaves fell and withered. Branches rotted and cracked. The trunk of the grand oak contracted and disintegrated into dust upon the forest floor as Emie's eyes began to glow with even more splendour. "What were those words you uttered earlier?" Eadric asked. "A chant, an incantation, a request," Emie replied. "A request for power and time, of course. And this is the real reason why we're out here, isn't it, Emie? You want someone to follow in your ways." "Drink from the bowl, Eadric Perrymane," Emie demanded. "The spirits know what your heart desires." "Even if I desired such power, I don't know the words," he said. "Retrieve the grimoire of summoning from within my satchel, Eadric Perrymane." He retrieved the glowing book from within her bag. The grimoire was warm to the touch, and upon staring at its cover, it opened to a particular page with illuminated letters arranged to form words he could not read. And yet, his mind understood them regardless. "You may not know the words, Eadric Perrymane, but the words know you. Speak them and share in my power." Emie demanded again. Eadric slowly began to step away from Emie. "No, no, Emie. I will not become whatever it is that you are. This is your path, Eadric Perrymane." She spoke from her hovering position. Her voice seemed not of a human female, but of an otherworldly entity. Eadric's resolve wavered like a flame in the wind. His soul caught between the teachings of the church and the stark reality of Emie's world. A world where dark magic might be the only shield against the encroaching night. The moon cast a silvery glow over the landscape, its light filtering into Emie's home through the parted curtains. Gloomy shadows played along the walls of her library, where volumes of arcane knowledge stood in quiet judgment. Era and Euphemia, like thieves in their own village, crept among the rows of books, their breaths shallow with trepidation. "Look at this," Era whispered, her fingers brushing against the spine of a weathered tome. "She delves into realms forbidden by God." Euphemia's eyes widened as she followed her sister's gaze to the sick Viking sprawled on Emie's bed. The man's breaths were ragged, his skin pallid under the spectral light. "We should not be here," she murmured, crossing herself. "This is the work of darkness." "Perhaps," Era replied. Her curiosity piqued despite her fear. "But if Emie can wield such powers, might she not protect Mozdeville from the invaders?" "By consorting with demons," Euphemia retorted, her voice rising in horror. "What price will she demand of us for such protection? We must tell Beric. Quiet your tongue, Era hissed, glancing nervously toward the ill man. We cannot risk a panic. And what of him? She gestured to the Viking. Should we end his suffering? Or is that another sin to lay at our feet? God have mercy, Euphemia said, torn between piety and compassion. Her hand hovered over the hilt of the dagger at her belt. Let us leave that decision to Emie, Era decided, her resolve hardening. But take something, proof of her dealings. Euphemia reached for a book, its title etched delicately but ominously. Grimoire of Banishment. With a heavy heart, she secreted it away beneath her cloak, the weight of it pressing against her chest like a stone.